Have you ever watched two giants stand face to face and realized that the smallest misstep could start a war? What if I told you that in the middle of the South China Sea, under a burning noonday sun, a single radio transmission, just a voice, nearly lit the fuse for a conflict the world wasn't ready for? They say you can feel it in your bones when danger is near. And for Commander Riley Weston, a 47-year-old American naval officer with salt in his veins and war in his bloodline, that moment came without warning, just static at first. Then a cold, flat voice with a Chinese accent crackled through the comms. "You are in Chinese waters. Turn around immediately, or face consequences." The deck of the USS. John Finn was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't happen at sea unless something's wrong. But here's the part no one talks about. The part that never makes it to the headlines. Riley didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't shout orders. He simply looked out over the blue, toward an invisible line in the ocean drawn not by nature, but by politics, by ambition, by fear. And then he did something that, to many, would seem reckless. He said no. There was no battle, no missiles fired. But in that moment, a line had been crossed, not on the water, but in the mind. This is the story of how one quiet confrontation woke up the world to a dangerous truth. And how the Philippine people, in ways no one expected, became part of something much, much bigger. It started, strangely enough, not with a fight, but with a question Riley couldn't answer. One that came weeks later, in a barangay hall in Palawan, asked by a Filipino fisherman with sunburned skin and a voice like gravel. "Why do your ships keep coming back here, Commander?" the man said. "Is it for us, or just to show power?" Riley had no answer. Not then, because before that day, the South China Sea had always just been a map to him. A zone, a theater of operation. He knew the numbers, how China had built over 3,000 acres of artificial islands, how they placed missile systems on reefs, how their Coast Guard ships were bullying fishermen from nations much smaller, much poorer. But he hadn't felt it. Not like the people in that room had. They weren't looking for war. They were just asking to fish the waters their grandfathers fished. They were just trying to live. And Riley, the tough, proud, battle-scarred American, suddenly felt very small. That was the beginning of the shift. Because once you see something through the eyes of the people who actually live there, who sleep within earshot of military jets, whose children grow up learning to fear Coast Guard sirens, you can't unsee it. One of those people was Antonio Ton Reyes, 62, a former fisherman who had once been chased by a Chinese vessel so close that he could see the eyes of the man shouting at him through a megaphone. Ton had lived through martial law, typhoons, and poverty. But he said nothing ever scared him like that day. "They didn't see me as a man," Ton told Riley. "Just an obstacle." That word stuck with Riley. Obstacle, because that's how people become casualties, not when they're hated, but when they're dehumanized. When powerful nations look at maps, but not faces. And somewhere between the barbed questions and the quiet meals he shared with those families in Palawan, Riley stopped seeing himself as a soldier guarding a boundary. He started seeing himself as a witness. But it wasn't always that simple, because back on the ship the pressure was rising. Washington wanted a stronger stance. Beijing was pushing harder each month. And even allies, even those in Manila, weren't always sure whether America's presence was a promise or a provocation. Lines blurred fast in waters that didn't belong to any one flag. And then, just weeks after Riley's visit to Palawan, it happened again. Same voice, same message. But this time, it wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. "You have 10 minutes to leave Chinese waters. This is your final notice." And this time, Riley wasn't alone. There was a Philippine Navy ship 5 nautical miles off the port side, and on board, a young Filipino officer named Lieutenant. Cielo Marquez, 34, was hearing the same message. Only her ship wasn't American. It wasn't armed the same way, and she didn't have the same backing. She was part of a navy still building its strength, but filled with people whose hearts beat with fire. What she did next would surprise even Riley, and it would change everything. Cielo Marquez had always believed in peace. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room or the most decorated, but what she lacked in volume, she made up for in something far more dangerous to those who underestimated her. Conviction. Her parents were school teachers from Iloilo. She grew up hearing bedtime stories not about fairy tales, but about courage, about Ninoy's quiet resistance, about nuns standing in front of tanks, about the nameless farmers who fought for land they'd never truly own. And now, here she was, on the bridge of the BRP Jose Rizal, facing a moment that no one had prepared her for. The voice from the Chinese vessel came again, firmer, colder, like a door closing. "You have entered Chinese territorial waters. Leave immediately, or we will take action." Everyone turned to her. She looked across the sea at the American destroyer still holding its line, Riley's ship, then back at her own crew, younger, nervous, waiting. And in that breathless moment, she spoke not just as a soldier, not even as a Filipino, but as someone who knew what fear tasted like and was no longer afraid of it. "Maintain course," she said. There was silence. Then a single voice from the back. "Ma'am, confirm." She turned slowly, met their eyes. "Yes, confirmed." What happened next didn't make headlines. No jet scrambled, no sirens screamed. The Chinese vessel veered, just slightly, then radio silence. But something had shifted. Because for once, the standoff wasn't between giants. It was between a nation that had everything, and a woman who had nothing to lose but her pride. That story, whispered at first, spread quickly through the mess halls, the barracks, the Facebook feeds of sailors across Southeast Asia. A Filipina officer holding her line. No backup plan, no dramatic rescue, just principle. And what Riley Weston felt in that moment wasn't triumph, it was humility. Back in Manila, the news barely covered it. It was just another day in the chessboard of maritime posturing. But in Palawan, in Zambales, in Batanes, fishermen heard what happened and stood a little taller. Because when one of your own refuses to bow, you remember that you're not alone. Riley flew back to the U.S. shortly after, but he wasn't the same. He spoke at a closed-door briefing in Washington, trying to explain what he had seen. The maps, the radar charts, the threat assessments, none of it captured the quiet resolve in Cielo's voice. "I stood on a billion-dollar ship," he told them, "but I saw more power that day on a vessel made with half the steel and 10 times the heart." The room didn't say much. They rarely did. But that wasn't the point anymore. Because Riley wasn't trying to win an argument. He was trying to tell a story about people who don't make demands, but still draw lines, not out of arrogance, but because they've been ignored too long. And the question began to surface, softly at first, then louder. What if the South China Sea wasn't just a battlefield? What if it was a mirror? Reflecting not just the ambitions of superpowers, but the soul of the region itself. Riley wrote a private letter to Cielo months later. He never expected a reply, but he wanted her to know. "You taught me something that day," he wrote. "I came here thinking we were the protectors, but you showed me what real protection looks like. It's quiet. It's not about strength. It's about presence." He closed with 5 words that still echo in military circles. "You didn't move, so we didn't." Cielo did reply, briefly, handwritten. "All I did was stand still. The sea carried the message." And it did, because that incident, as small as it was, began to ripple. In quiet conversations between officers from Vietnam and Indonesia, in whispers among Japanese analysts and Australian allies. In a closed meeting in Brussels, where one diplomat reportedly asked, "Why is the Philippines standing firmer than we are?" And in classrooms, yes, classrooms, where Filipino students began to hear the story of a woman who simply refused to turn away. Not to provoke, not to fight, but to stay, to exist, to matter. And maybe that's what frightened China the most. Not the ships, but the silence, because in that silence there was something unstoppable, a people awakening to their worth, and the world was starting to listen. You see, something strange happens when a small voice refuses to be silenced. People start to lean in, and across the world, in capitals far from the shores of Palawan, that small voice began to echo louder than anyone expected. In Tokyo, a senior naval analyst mentioned the incident during a parliamentary defense briefing. No footage existed, but the retelling had spread like folklore. A Filipina officer standing firm, shoulder to shoulder with a U.S. warship, not flinching under the threat of confrontation. In Canberra, a retired admiral described it as the moment the Philippines stopped being a pawn and started acting like a player. But for Cielo, back at her small desk in Sangley Point, life went on as usual. There were no medals, no promotions, just more drills, more protocols, more strategy meetings. And yet, something had changed. Not outside, but inside. The crew walked taller. The young women in her team watched her with different eyes. Not the eyes that say, "You're strong," but the ones that whisper, "Maybe I can be too." Because in a world where power is often measured by who yells the loudest, it's easy to forget that calm defiance is also a kind of roar. And in the towns along the West Philippine Sea, that roar was finally being heard. For years, fishermen like Ton Reyes had felt invisible. Their complaints were ignored. Their catch was shrinking. Chinese ships would shadow them, sometimes days at a time, reminding them that they didn't belong in their own waters. But now, there was a shift in the air. Local radio stations played folk songs about standing firm. Children began drawing boats flying the Philippine flag in classrooms, big, bold strokes, with little ships refusing to turn back. It wasn't politics. It was something older, deeper. Pride. Not the kind that comes from government, but the kind that comes from the people. Ton, who used to come home quiet after every fishing trip, now spoke with his chest lifted. "They're still out there," he'd say, nodding toward the horizon. "But so are we." And in Washington, Riley was changing too. He had always seen the Pacific as a strategic map, one full of assets and threat vectors. But after his time in Palawan, something in him refused to let that be the whole story. He began pushing for new kinds of engagement. More joint patrols, yes, but also more listening tours. More exchanges not just of technology, but of story. Because what he realized, and what more in the Pentagon began to see, was this. You can't protect people you don't understand, and you can't claim to stand beside someone if you never bothered to stand with them. He returned to the Philippines that December, not as a commanding officer, but as a guest, a quiet observer at a symposium on maritime cooperation. He found Cielo there. They didn't speak much, just a handshake, a brief nod, but it was enough. Because sometimes the deepest respect is wordless. Later that evening, as a gentle rain fell over Manila Bay, Riley stood on the pier, watching the silhouettes of small boats dotting the water. An old man sat beside him, weathered hands clasped over his knees. "You looking for the warships?" the man asked with a grin. Riley chuckled. "Not tonight." The man nodded toward the small bank of boats drifting out. "Those are our real Navy," he said. "Storms don't scare them, not even threats." Riley looked again, and this time he didn't see a weak coast or a vulnerable zone. He saw resilience, Filipino resilience, the kind that doesn't march or shout. It rows, it waits, it endures, and maybe that's why the standoff mattered more than anyone predicted. Not because it sparked a battle, but because it prevented one, by proving that courage doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it just holds its course. And as more nations began to rethink their stance in the South China Sea, something quietly powerful began to happen. The Philippines, long underestimated, often ignored, started becoming a moral compass, not because it had the biggest ships, but because it had the clearest voice. And clarity, in a world of noise, is a kind of power no one can easily sink. Years from now, no one will remember the exact coordinates. They won't recite the radio logs or the size of the ships involved. They might not even remember the name of the reef where it happened. But somewhere in a classroom in Quezon Province, a girl named Alona will raise her hand when her teacher asks, "What makes a nation strong?" And she'll say, "Kapag hindi ka natatakot, kahit mas maliit ka." When you're not afraid, even when you're smaller. That's what this was about all along. Not borders, not oil, not posturing. It was about presence, dignity, and what happens when a people stop asking for permission to exist and simply stand where they've always belonged. Cielo Marquez never wanted to be a hero. She never set out to challenge China or to be quoted in think tanks or whispered about in diplomatic circles. She just didn't want to move. And that decision, simple as it was, became something far larger than herself. It became a symbol, because Filipinos, we know what it means to wait through storms, to face down forces bigger, louder, more violent. We've done it for centuries, from colonizers to dictators to typhoons. We've endured not by matching force for force, but by outlasting it, outloving it, outfaithing it. And now, in a world spinning faster, sharper, more dangerous, that kind of strength is becoming rare. But not here, not in the Philippines. It's in the fishermen who return to the sea, even after being chased. It's in the students who study harder, knowing they'll have to fight twice as hard to be heard. It's in the soldiers who don't seek war, but won't flee from peace. And it's in the mothers who pray for their sons, and the fathers who teach their daughters that courage doesn't always come in the form of shouting. Sometimes it comes in stillness. Riley Weston returned to the U.S. for good the following year. He retired early. But before he did, he delivered one final speech, this time not in a war room, but at a university commencement. He spoke softly, but with the weight of a man who had seen power from both sides. "There's a country you don't hear about enough," he said. "It doesn't have nuclear subs. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't brag. But it has something no war machine can replicate." He paused. Conviction. And somewhere in the back of that hall, a Philippine flag stitched onto a backpack quietly fluttered as someone stood and clapped first. Back in Palawan, Ton Reyes grew older, slower, but he still went out on the water some mornings, just to feel the wind, just to remember. His grandson once asked him, "Lolo, are we really safe?" And Ton looked out at the sea, calm, open, blue, and smiled gently. "No one is ever fully safe," he said, "but we are seen now, that matters." Because in the end, wars are not always won with missiles. Sometimes they're won with memory, with the stories we tell our children, with the lines we refuse to erase. And while the South China Sea remains contested, and the waves still carry whispers of tension, there's also something else in those waters now. A presence, the sense that someone is watching, that the world is paying attention, that the Philippines, quiet, brave, battered but unbowed, has drawn its line, not just on a map, but in history, and the world is beginning to listen. If this story moved you, even just a little, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to help more people hear what the world often ignores. Subscribe if you believe the Philippines deserves to be seen, heard, and remembered. Not just as a country, but as a people who quietly stand their ground. And in the comments, tell us, what does Filipino courage mean to you? Let's make sure these stories live on, not just in headlines, but in hearts.